Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Dominions 5 Strategy. We're actually going to go back to a nation that I've looked at in the past, although not quite in this context. I am referring, of course, to Mekone, the Brazen Giants. We've looked at them before. I did a whole little brief single-player series on them. But they have changed somewhat since then, and I felt this was timely for me because I'm going to be going into a multiplayer game playing as Mekone fairly shortly, which is a little bit scary considering they're still not by any means one of the stronger nations. And it kind of gives me a chance to organize my thoughts. So we're taking a break from the pop kills. We're going to take a look at Mekone, see what's changed, what's still the same, what their weaknesses are, their strengths. They do have some. And we'll go from there. So, Mekone has the big, Mekone's strength is very, very tough giants. So you have the Giganti Hoplites, troop-wise. Let's actually look at the troops first, and we'll start over here, because this is, in my opinion, one of the two most important units Mekone has. The Giganti Hoplites are probably the second toughest recruitable troop in the game, behind Nephil Giants. And they have some advantages even over Nephil Giants to an extent. They have very high protection, quite high hit points, and excellent stats across the board. Magic resistance and morale are both quite high. Attack skill and defense skill are both quite high. These were buffed after Mekone was released. Their strength is also very high. They pay for all this with an exorbitant resource cost, primarily. Their gold cost is pretty high, but not out of line. The resource cost is quite high because they're using this bronze magical armor, which costs a lot of resources. But protection 21 on a giant chassis is not to be overlooked. They are limited recruitment. You can recruit 4 per turn in your capital, and 1 per turn in any other fort. However, they also have Formation Fighter, which greatly mitigates the major weakness of giants, that being that they can only stand 1 per square. Giganti Hoplites can fit 2 in a square, and that makes them actually much better than you would think. Normally, giants just get cut down by human-sized troops because they can only fit 1 per square, and so they get a lot of stacking harass penalties, and they eventually get chopped down just by little hits if nothing else. Giganti Hoplites don't have that problem, at least not nearly so much. With 2 Giganti Hoplites in a square, you can fend off human attackers pretty well, and with their high attack and damage stats, if a Giganti Hoplite hits a human, it's very likely to kill him. So, Giganti Hoplites are strong units. The downfall is that you can't recruit enough. You can't recruit them quickly. Like I said, maximum 4 per turn in the capital, maximum 1 per turn anywhere else. You do not have many Gigantes. One other special benefit of them is that they have magic weapons and magic armor. In the latest patch, which released today, magic armor was fixed. Before this, magic armor did not resist the armor destruction spells, Armor of Achilles and Destruction. Now it does. It's not a perfect defense, but it's, if I recall correctly, it's a 75% chance to negate the effect of Destruction or Armor of Achilles, and then even if it takes effect, it actually takes 2 hits of Destruction to actually fully break the armor. First it is damaged, and then it is broken. Sort of slightly counterbalancing that, Destruction now also affects helmets and shields, which it wasn't doing before. But still, basically in order to actually take the armor off Giganti Hoplites and reduce their protection, you are going to have to hit them with Destruction a lot. You're going to have many overlapping casts of Destruction, because it's going to take on average 8 hits to actually fully remove the armor from a Giganti Hoplite. So that takes away one of the major easy counters, which was researching Alteration and then sending out a whole bunch of Earth 1 mages who could cast Armor of Achilles, and they would always target Giganti Hoplites because they have huge hit points, and just rip the armor off them. You also have the Giganti Ekdromos, and the Giganti Ekdromos are just Hoplites wearing lighter armor, and as a consequence they have slightly higher defense skill. So they're still quite solid, and they cost only 2/3 of the resources. So if you're running out of resources, recruiting Ekdromos to bulk out your Hoplites is an excellent idea. On top of that, the Ekdromos have a different recruitment cap, so you can recruit 4 Hoplites, and then if you still have resources left over, you can also recruit 4 Ekdromos. They also have Skirmisher, But to be honest, I don't think I would ever want to put them in a skirmish or sparse line formation, because that would just open up gaps? I guess maybe there's a strategy where you intersperse a unit of Ekdromos in sparse line with a unit of Hoplites, but I would just put them all in the same squad, and I believe when you do that, the Ekdromos automatically go to the flanks. So, you know, mixing these two in a squad is a little bit fraught because the Ekdromos will run ahead, so you want to stagger one line behind another, but mixing these two is perfectly fine. You have the Discoboluses. Discoboluses also have a recruitment cap. They are still Gigantes. They only cost 7 resources, though. And they have a very high damage ranged attack. It's quite inaccurate, but it's very high damage, and it has reasonable range. So Discoboluses, they also have 2 attacks in melee. You don't really want them in melee because they will die with protection 3, but they can do reasonable damage before they die. So they're a worthwhile recruit as well. In terms of human troops, so the Gigante Hoplite is to my mind the most important of the giant troops, because it is so tough. If you cast Legions of Steel on Gigante Hoplites, their protection goes up to 23. Or 24. I don't remember if it's 23 or 24. It depends on how the stacking works. I think it's actually 23, because I think you effectively lose a point of natural protection to stacking rules. But 23 protection and 30 hit points makes them very nearly unkillable to anything that is not also a high attack giant unit, of which there are not many. So it makes them certainly the toughest massable unit out there, even though they're not very massable. Neefle Giants are still individually stronger, having more hit points and the chill aura and cold power, I believe. But even so, Gigante Hoplites are tough. The second most important unit is actually this one, the Helit Peltast, and it's solely because this unit is dirt nasty cheap and has javelins. So you can recruit millions and millions and millions of Helit Peltasts and just have them throw javelins at things, and they will hurt them, and then they'll go into combat, and they're like indie light infantry in combat. So things that have already been hit with a bunch of javelins, they can mop up. Basically, for my money, your expansion recruitment for Mekone is Gigante Hoplites, and then you use Helit Peltasts to fill out the rest of your gold when you don't have enough resources to recruit another Gigante Hoplite. You build up Hoplites over time. Once you have an army of like 8 to 12 Hoplites, that group can pretty much roll any given indie province. It's not hard. You can lead them with your mages that you're recruiting, because your mages do have some leadership and a morale bonus. Their leadership is artificially low, but they have multiple squad leadership, which gives them the morale bonuses. And they also have Taskmaster, so if necessary, they can also lead Helit units with their Taskmaster ability. Your Locos have more Taskmaster, and your Polar Marches, but the mages work fine, and it means you don't have to take time off recruiting Locos. Helit Hoplites are extremely tanky chaff. They have Prot 17, which is very high for how little gold they cost. However, they cost almost 30 resources, and you're already resource capped. I wouldn't be recruiting these guys much. Maybe if you have a non-capital fort that already has a lot of resources, and you've already recruited your 1 Hoplite for the turn, pump out some Helit Hoplites. They're very, very tanky chaff, like I said, so you can use them. They also have Formation Fighter. They are slaves, unfortunately, but they can do pretty well for themselves. The Helit Ekdromos I don't really like because their protection is low enough that they tend to just die, and they still cost twice as many resources as gold. So you're still going to hit your resource cap pretty heavily. You can also recruit Peroeki Peltasts, which I would never do, because if you look at the stats, the only difference between a Peroeki Peltast and a Helit Peltast is morale. Literally the only difference. It's 3 extra points of morale, which, in my opinion, doesn't matter much for light infantry like this. And for those 3 extra points of morale, you're not only paying 2 extra gold, you're also paying double recruitment points, and their upkeep cost is 8 gold per year instead of 3. So they cost you more money. The main strength of the Helit units, in my opinion, is that they cost almost no upkeep. So you can mass these guys. They cost you a quarter of a gold per turn. You can crap out 50 or 60 or 100, and it doesn't hardly affect your income, which is good because of all the problems, that Mekone has with income. It also helps counterbalance your Gigante Hoplites, which cost you quite a bit of money, since they do cost 40 gold per unit. They cost you they cost you more than most Sacreds, because most Sacreds have the Sacred ability that halves upkeep, and Gigante Hoplites don't. So they're expensive. And Gigante Ekdromos are just as expensive, and Discoboluses are almost as expensive. On top of that, all of your mages are expensive. So, Healet Peltasts, Healet Hoplites sometimes. I would ignore Paroeki Peltasts entirely. They're a trap. They cost you more money, and they don't perform all that much better. More Healet Hoplites will do a better job. Healet Ekdromos I would also mainly ignore. Gigante Ekdromos, on the other hand, they have high enough prot that they can still function fairly effectively in the battle line. And they cost less resources, so recruiting them when you're limited on resources, which is almost all the time, is a decent idea. When it comes to commanders, you've got a scout, just a normal old bog standard Paroeki scout. You've got a Neodemode commander, and the Neodemode commander has okay leadership, okay-ish leadership, reasonable stats, and formation fighter, but no taskmaster, and can't lead giants, because your Gigante units refuse to be led by anything that is size 2, just like the Gigantes of Phlegra. So I don't really recruit these guys either. The Locos is a lot more expensive, but has higher leadership, and Taskmaster +2, so he effectively makes your Healet's morale 10, and he can lead giants. So if you're going to recruit a national commander, I would probably bite my tongue and shell out for the Locos. He's a lot more flexible, a lot more useful for you overall. Same map move though, he doesn't get to be any faster because he's a giant, which is a little bit unusual. Normally giants are fast. The Gigantes are not fast because they wear all this very heavy armor. So you can see here, his base map move is 18, this Neodemo commander, which is fast for a human. And the Locos' base map move is 20, which is not fast for a giant, and then he also has a huge armor penalty to his map move. Mage-wise, so troop-wise, Mekone is honestly in a pretty decent place, especially after the patches. When Gigante Hoplites got their stats buffed, now that Destruction has a hard time affecting magical armor, Gigante Hoplites are a good troop, and I recruit them. They have magical attacks, which can be very important. They have magical armor, they have very high protection, they're solid. Gigante Ekdromos, still solid, less protection, a little more vulnerable, but still very useful. It's the mages that let Mekone down. So first off, these two are your recruit anywhere mages. All of these four are all capital only. Gigantes are largely worthless, to be fully honest. They have priest level 1 and 1 path, which is either fire or earth. They can research, and they can do some limited forging, and that's it. They are not combat mages. They are old, so they take penalties. They have good stats. I mean, all your mages have really good stats, considering. Which is good. Even with the old age, they're still very solid. But they are old, which means they will get afflictions over time. They're Inquisitors, which is an interesting little ability that combines with some of Mekone's Dominion special abilities. And they have Taskmaster, so they can lead small groups of slaves. For my money, Gigantes are only useful as lab monkeys, lab rats, and for leading small reinforcement parties of giants. If you start recruiting Gigantes, you can use them to lead giants instead of Locos, because while they have smaller leadership, they still have the morale bonus. And they can still put people in lines, which is what you want. And you're very rarely going to have more than 30 Gigantes anyway in one army, at least not until the mid or late game. So, for that, I'd still recruit them. They're also the closest thing you have to efficient research. They cost 110 gold, but since they are sacred, they only cost 44 gold a year in upkeep, which is only slightly more than a hoplite does. So, for research efficiency purposes, Gigantes are what you want. That said, they are slow researchers. They only give you 7 points per turn, and they have very, very little utility outside the lab. The E4 is going to be your general recruit, general purpose mage. Like the Gigante, he is old. He is a taskmaster. He does have good leadership despite limited numbers. However, he gets 3 paths instead of 1. He has 1 fire, 1 earth, and then a random in fire, earth, or air. What this means is, combat-wise, 1/3 of E4s are pretty good, with earth 2. 1/3 of them are highly mediocre, with Fire 2, and 1/3 of them are worthless, with Fire 1, Air 1, Earth 1. It's not a good luck. You end up paying 540 gold on average for one good, solid Earth 2 mage. However, they are faster researchers, albeit not more efficient ones. They pay 180 for 11 research points. Upkeep, still not terrible. 72 gold per year for 11 research points. I'll take it. It's below 1-to-1 ratio, which is kind of my benchmark for relatively efficient. They actually have worse stats because they are older. They're age 297, whereas the Gerontes, that's interesting. It's actually they are exactly the same age, but the Gerontes, because they have fire magic. Yeah, fire magic lowers your age limit. So the E4s are older because they have fire magic by default. So Gerontes who random fire will be that old still. In any case, their stats are nothing to write home about. They are priests, so they can bless sacred units, which of course you don't have. And they do have combat utility. You know, most of them can either throw fireballs or cast earth spells. And the ones who can't, you could still give them a fire in a jar or something, so you can make it work. It's just not efficient. So those are your only two Recruit Anywhere mages. And the E4 is basically your standard battle mage by default, because he's your only Recruit Anywhere battle mage. Gerontes just don't do it. They don't have the paths to be effective. So it's E4s or nothing. Polar Marches, Archons, Elder Cyclops, and Basiliuses, all capital only. They crowd the capital enormously. Polar Marches are really, really good thug chassis. They're very good leaders, with a massive morale bonus to slaves and a good one to normal troops. They're sacred, they're formation fighters, they have Earth 2 and Fire 2, which are great thugging paths, and they are combat casters, so even if they're attacked in melee, they can still cast spells, and they don't take double armor encumbrance for casting, which is big, because their armor encumbrance is huge, because they wear this very, very heavy golden armor. So that's the most important benefit of combat casting for them. They take less encumbrance from casting spells. However, they are expensive as hell. A Polar March costs almost as much as my point of comparison is the Flagrant Tyrant here. A Polar March costs very nearly the same as a Flagrant Tyrant. Has about half the paths, a little more than half the paths. Is not Berserk. Has only slightly above half the protection. Stat-wise is actually better. More protection, more attack, more defense skill, but lower strength. But I don't know. Now they are sacred, so their upkeep is not unreasonable. So if you can stomach the upfront cost, and especially the resource cost, Polar Marches are a good recruit. They're good leaders, they're good thugs. They are not, of course, good researchers at all in any way, but they're okay. Archons are the other non-slow-to-recruit capital-only mage. And they are basically a slightly upgraded E4. They're actually identical to an E4 in terms of paths, special abilities, all that stuff, leadership, sacred, priest level 1. However, they have 2 linked randoms. So they can be Fire 3, Earth 3, or Air 2. That actually makes them pretty solid, especially because they have higher stats. Because for some weird reason, they're not necessarily old. If they random fire, they're old, for sure, because fire reduces your age cap. But they're not necessarily always old, which is nice. Also, since they have these better stats, and especially since they have massive magic resistance, base magic resistance of 17, which is, I think... Yeah, well, it's slightly less than the Elder Cyclops, but that's really high. So you can actually also turn Archons into thugs, especially if they random Air 2. You can give an Archon gear and have him cloud trapeze in on top of an enemy army or to raid provinces or something. And with gear, especially with protection gear, and a weapon and a shield and all that, Archons make perfectly viable thugs. Expensive, this is a unifying theme in Mekone. Everything that's at all good is expensive. And he's not slow to recruit, so that's nice, recruitment points too. Then you have 2 slow to recruit capital only mages, which only increases the cramping. The Elder Cyclops, who is a really, really good caster, and also a Master Smith, so he can forge higher level items. Randoms an elemental path with a 10% of another elemental path. So, good paths, strong paths, excellent foraging capabilities, can random water, and if he randoms water, he can easily boost himself up water. You can use Elder Cyclops. If you get a fire random Elder Cyclops and a water random Elder Cyclops, you can rapidly boost the water random up to be able to forge Staffs of Elemental Mastery, which really helps your mages a lot. But, I mean, these are big casters and they're big forgers. They certainly can't fight very well, which is fine. You don't expect everyone to be able to fight. They're useful. You want them. Unfortunately, they're slow to recruit, and being slow to recruit and expensive in a nation that's already full of expensive things means it's hard to get all that many. And then you have the Basilius. The Basilius is your most expensive mage. He's the only one with guaranteed water magic. He's also holy 2. Given the description, revered by his kin, worshipped by humans, almost a god in his own right, I don't know why he's not holy 3, but he's holy 2. And he's quite old. He's the only good leadership non-combat mage you have, and his Taskmaster too, so you can use him to lead armies, although that would be a huge waste. He randoms an elemental path with another 10%er. So this is where you get your water magic from, if you want water magic. Basiliuses also have a special national spell they can cast that I'll talk about when I move on to the Pretender God, which is nice, but very, very limited. And of course, once again, they are Inquisitors, so they can preach other faiths away very rapidly. Solid, once again, very solid mages, slow to recruit, capital only, in a capital that is already crowded. Basically, all the good mages are in the capital. So capital recruitment turns are an incredibly limited resource for Mekone. In terms of sites, you've got the City of Gold and Marble, which gives you air and earth gems, and enables recruitments of 3 of your capital-only mages. And then you've got the Forge of the Cyclops, which gives you fire and earth and resources, and enables recruitment of the Elder Cyclops. So, your capital produces a lot of resources, so you can actually hit your recruitment cap on giants here. It also produces a lot of earth gems, some fire gems, and a small air gem income. All of which are handy, but perhaps not the very most handy. When you go into Pretender chassis, basically you have a very limited selection because the giants of Mekone refuse to worship anything that is small. That's literally the explanation. I don't know how the Demi-Lich got away with it, but the Demi-Lich somehow snuck in. Maybe it's a giant skull. But you have no rainbow chassis at all. You've also lost most of the Titans. Most of the Titans are not acceptable to the giants of Mekone either. So you've got monsters, you've got a few monstrous Titans plus the Titan of Forethought, who is against the gods, and so Mekone likes, and you have immobile statues. Mekone is pretty good at early expansion, but I feel like they need to be really good at early expansion in order to be competitive, and the reason for that is, if you look here at the Dominion combat bonus, the buildings, advanced fortified cities, this is really good because it means your first level of fort that you build gives you an extra command point, so you can ramp up your recruitment a little bit quicker. Forts increase unrest. We talked about that during my single-player campaign. That is still the case. Your forts both passively generate unrest, which reduces income, and you have the yearly Crypteon events, which cause a massive hit of unrest and then pop kill. As a result, Mekone's income is terrible. It's bad. You lose a ton of money. Because even 10% unrest in a fort reduces income by, I believe, like 15%, something like that, which on a rich fort could easily be 40 gold per fort, per turn, and then extra in the fall. And then you also lose some income permanently when some of the population is killed every year. It's bad. You do not make much money, and especially it's bad because all your stuff is expensive. Now, your mages are sacred. That helps a lot by cutting upkeep in half. But, if you recruit many Elder Cyclops, they cost you more than 20 gold a turn each. Basilius only cost you about 12 a turn each, but the main strength of your army is going to be Gigante units, and Gigantes cost you a couple gold each per turn, so your upkeep is going to go up and up and up and up and up, and your income is not necessarily going to go up as you expand, especially if you keep building a lot of forts. So paradoxically, Mekone almost doesn't want to build forts in rich areas. They almost want to build forts in places that are marginal, because Gigantes do not cost many recruitment points. They cost 25, which is half of what a heavy cavalry costs. And Helots cost 4. So you don't really need recruitment points much. And you don't really want to build forts on your really rich provinces because you want the unrest there to stay at 0 to maximize the income. So and you want a ton of resources. So what you actually kind of want to do is find, like, forests and mountains that have relatively high population and so have, maybe 60 or 70 recruitment points, and build forts there. Because even if you build a fort on 60 recruitment points, that still buffs you up to about 90 or 100. And with 100 recruitment points, you can recruit a hoplite, an Ekdromos, and like 10 Helot Peltasts. And that's fine in terms of recruitment. It's more than pretty much anybody else can manage in situations like that. And it preserves your farms to be like peaceful little places that just generate money for you, where none of the Gigantes ever really go, and everything's fine and everyone's happy. So, in terms of magic, you don't have any sacred units, but what you do have is sacred, highly thuggable commanders. And to be honest, while it isn't a very efficient strategy, I feel like thugging commanders is going to be a big part of Mekone's strategy because you don't have a whole lot else, to be honest. Your battle magic is mediocre, and your units definitely need support by the mid-game. So what you want, really, is you want some kind of moderate bless that can be useful to a thug, and then you want scales. Which leads me to the Drakon. The Drakon is a nature chassis. The Drakon can expand very, very well on its own. And the Drakon can also carry Earth, which is a great buff path for itself. So this, right here, that's probably the biggest bless you want to take as Mekone, would be regeneration and then unbreakable or something similar in Earth. You can take a temperature scale. You need growth, you need production 3. You have to have those scales. You also really want magic 3. But you can get rid of magic 3 before you can get rid of the others. You may notice this leaves you negative. Mekone has one hero who's kind of good, but he's not amazing. He's a Polar March with Dominion Immortality is what he is, which is pretty cool, but not cool enough to be worth it. So I would probably dump Misfortune. It hurts, but you can live without Misfortune. You can live with Misfortune better than you can live with pretty much anything else. And even then, at this point, you have to drop Turmoil at least 1 point, probably 2. And it's not a very efficient build, but this one works. It does give you Turmoil, which makes your unrest problems even worse. Ideally, on Mekone, I would want Order 3, because unrest reduction for you on your forts is valuable in a way that it's not valuable for most other nations. But sometimes you can't afford it. The other option is to ditch regen and to take either Earth 6 and to take either Earth 6 for Hardskin or like Nature 5 Earth 4, the cheapo Drakon, like you would use on Phlegra. That would give you decent scales points. And then you could take Unbreakable and Recuperation, which is okay. It's not a Thug Bless, but it's okay. I feel like on Mekone you want scales so much that it's okay to drop the Bless. It's okay to go more or less blessless. Your Drakon can still expand with Earth 4 just fine. And Nature 5 will give you nature access, which you desperately, desperately want, without having to spend a lot on it. So I would probably just take some like nature utility blesses here. Leave it at this, gives you decent dominion, gives you pretty good scales. Let it be what it is. Other options. If you don't want an awake expander, you can take the Statue of Fertility. And the Statue of Fertility can carry N7 a little more cheaply, and can also carry nature, and actually saves you enough points that you can do regeneration and some higher level Earth Bless with the same scales. Since Mekone has good expansion already, that can be worth it. That'll let you get a point of magic or a point of order. I would probably take the magic. That can be worth it because, as I said, Mekone has pretty good expansion. Expanding with Giganti Hoplites and hordes of Helot Peltasts works okay. So you might be able to get away without an Awake Expander. In fact, you might even be able to take this guy dormant and bump up your scales like that way, or kill the Misfortune. I don't know what's exactly the best scales-wise. My build in the game that I was referring to earlier actually uses the Extra Pretenders mod, which gives Mekone some interesting new chassis, and I'm using one of the new chassis. But for the purpose of a native game discussion, I'm not going to talk about that too much. I would be tempted by this. This gives you really good scales, including buffing your research, which you desperately, desperately need, and a good bless once your god wakes up, which will happen fairly soon. With the strength of your troops, earlier on, I kind of had come to the conclusion that Mekone was a little bit rush bait because they couldn't get good enough troops in enough quantities given their money problems to stop a rush by a nation that can do that. Now that Giganti Hoplites have been buffed and their armor is now pretty much immune to being destroyed, I think it's probably worthwhile just sink money into recruiting the maximum number of Gigantes that you can, which makes you hard to rush. Like, these guys are good for expansion, but a little bit vulnerable to rushes, because if they get hit by something tough, they just shatter and run off the field. These guys don't. Gigantes normally do not run off the field. They normally kill what they're fighting, unless they're fighting Mega Bless Sacreds. If you start next to Vanheim with a Mega Bless, he's going to rush you, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you start next to Mictlan may try to rush you, and there's not much you can do about it. But you can fight Mictlan. Vanheim would be tough to fight. But you're in with a shot, and I think Mekone is one of the nations where it's worth the risk, probably, of not taking an Awake in order to get a better Bless. Now, I would be tempted to still take a mobile chassis with nature, just for the, just so that you can move around and sight search nature later on. There's not many options. It's the Drakon or nothing. And the Drakon does make it more expensive, so you are going to still have to lose a scale or so. You're going to have to lose a couple of scales, actually. Oof. Yeah, that's rough. Probably just take the Misfortune back and go Dom 4. Going low Dominion is actually easier on Mekone than most because your Dominion has a conflict bonus, so you're good at wiping out enemy Dominions. Plus, all of your priests are Inquisitors, so if you do need to preach, you're effectively doubled for the purpose of reducing enemy Dominion. Can be useful. It's a little bit niche, but it can be useful. So like a dormant Drakon with Incarnate Blesses might actually work out. You still have pretty good scales. You can drop the magic if you want. Get another point of Dominion. Could get another level of magic, but you don't really need it. So I'd probably keep one magic. And then that leaves you with a bunch of points you can't use, but who cares, really? It gives you what you wanted. National spells. Mekone actually got a couple of new national spells just recently. Well, they got one new national spell just recently. Ignore how this list looks. I have the debug mod on right at the moment. So they always had Summon Hound of Twilight. They also have Bind Carries, which is a spell that Arco primarily makes use of. They can't cast it because they don't have any native death magic, and I wouldn't really recommend taking a Death Pretender on Mekone, but it's there. Cares are pretty good. And then they also have this spell, Procession of the Underworld, which summons Lampads. Lampads are a new unit. They're an underworld nymph, and the interesting thing about them is they have a stat that makes an army containing them much less likely to get damaged while using Stygian paths, and they all come with a weapon that's effectively a firebrand, but it does decay damage instead of fire damage, which isn't elementally resistible, and also, of course, causes decay. So effectively, they've got Banefire. They're very, very powerful anti-elite troops. In fact, they're pretty good against anything, assuming you buff them. But, Mekone still has serious problems. After the latest patch, I think they're a lot better than they have been. You've got strong troops that are definitely worth leaning on. Your trouble will be transitioning out of the early game into the mid game with your pretty garbage mages. I mean, E4s are not good mages. They're okay. They're acceptable, especially since they're sacred and so cost less upkeep, but they're not good. And since you're giants, your infrastructure is expensive. So you have a lot of things that cost you money. You do not have much money. And you're going to struggle. You also don't have, you don't even have the option to take a cheap rainbow chassis. If you really, really wanted to, if you were really, really going to go full ham, you could take an imprisoned immobile with minor blesses. And the minor blesses you would want, reinvigoration would be really good. Poison resistance, unaging, those ones would be good. Attack skill, fire, elemental resistances would be good. If you were going that route, you could at that point even take a death, a death pretender, and take some undying or withering weapons, something like that. So there's options there. I haven't played around with that much because personally I find imprisoned pretenders to be very risky. But if there was a nation that was going to be able to pull it off, it would be Mekone. So those are kinds of my thoughts at the moment. You definitely want, like, no matter what you do, you want good scales. You want pretty much the best scales you can afford because Mekone desperately needs scales. You need money, you need resources, especially. You need growth. I would... Like I said, Mekone is one of the few nations where I think it's probably worth potentially taking an imprisoned pretender for the purpose of taking really, really, really good scales. And I think that's probably a viable way to play them. So, stay tuned. I will be uploading videos of the Mekone game. As I said, I'll be using an expanded pretender chassis, so not one of the native ones. And I'll talk about what he is and why I designed him that way during the game. So, look out for that, and I'll see you next time. Alright, I have to do a quick addendum here because I forgot to talk about some of Mekone's other national spells. And this one I think I didn't talk about before because it was added after the single-player Mekone campaign was ongoing. The Blessing of the Godslayer. It's a 0 research spell. It costs water gems. So, effectively, only the Basilius can cast it because it requires water and holy crosspath. And what it does is you cast it on a polemarch, and it gives him, if I recall correctly, inspirational +5 attack and +5 defense. So it makes a polemarch really, really good, but only for 1 year. Basically the use of this is, you spend water gems, cast this on a polemarch, and then send that polemarch out to go stab people in the face, which he does very, very well after those buffs. You also, of course, have Sow Dragon Teeth. We looked at that spell before. It was buffed to... I think that happened while the campaign was ongoing. It summons 10 Spartae, which are very, very solid chaff units. So, that's a good one. Beyond that, they do have some of the other national Greek spells. They can forge the Brass Bull, the Calcotaurus. I've talked about Calcotauri before, I believe. They're not very efficient. They're expensive. I actually talked about them in the Therados video, and they're exactly the same. And then they also have the... I think it's in Conjuration. Yeah, the Hound of Twilight, as well as this Procession of the Underworld spell that I talked about. Hounds of Twilight are great, but they require death magic. And there's no real practical way to get death magic on Mekone except a Pretender, which I usually wouldn't bother to do. Anyway, I just needed to add the little quick adaptation to the little quick addendum to talk about those spells a little bit. Blessing of the Godslayer is a good one. It's very limited in use, but it's an excellent reason to have a Basilius kind of hanging around, forging and doing stuff. Having a Basilius is also useful because they can make holy water, which allows you to apply your blessing to your polar march. I thought maybe possibly people were confused about why I was talking about the blessing when polar marches aren't priests and so can't bless themselves. The two ways to do that are either you forge a holy water, which is a miscellaneous item that gives them your blessing, or you send an E4 or Geronti with them to cast blessing on them. Probably the holy water is better. If you have a regeneration bless, and then possibly some reinvigoration, it effectively acts as two items at once. So it's definitely a worthwhile use of a miscellaneous slot. Slots and gem cost, of course, are definitely the biggest hinks in gearing a polar march. You can gear them to be really good at something, but it's hard to gear them to adequately defend themselves against everything. Since they don't have any native resists, and they don't berserk or anything, they're probably, to be honest, Armor of the Elements is one of the best items you can give them. Armor of the Elements, Holy Water for a regen bless, Shield of Gleaming Gold or Vine Shield if you have it. Probably Shield of Gleaming Gold, to be honest. And then whatever other items you have to fill in the rest of the slots. And send them off and see how they do. They will do pretty well if they're appropriately geared. They can cast Phoenix Pyre. They can buff their own protection, fire, and lightning resist. So they can do some pretty good work. But in any case, just wanted to add that little note, that little fillip to Mekone.